have the pleasure of being with Dr. Aggarwal, um, and he is one of the experts in myositis. He just gave a wonderful talk about dermatomyositis and kind of going through a clinical case. Um, but first off, we'd just kind of like to ask you kind of about IVIG and Octagam, and how that's kind of been a game changer.
Sure. The IVIG clinical trial is a big game changer for all myositis patients, mainly because before IVIG we did not have even a single regulatory approved treatment. So what Octagam did is really one proved by randomized controlled double-blind placebo-controlled trial, a phase 3 trial, that IVIG works and is safe and tolerable, but also it led to an FDA approval for which, because of which our patients are now able to get IVIG much more easily. But more importantly, it also opened a pathway for other therapeutic targets, other companies to come in and experiment their drug in dermatomyositis patient if it makes sense. So that pathway was important for the companies to see if they actually show safety and efficacy in dermatomyositis, they may get FDA approval. So I think was why the IVIG study was a game changer. It worked for our patients, but also opened other options for our patients in future.
Um, Another question, speaking of clinical trials, and especially in your case you were giving, it was more of a patient that had more skin manifestations.
Hmm.
And a lot of times we see in clinical trials, they're set up so much muscle heavy.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of one of our goals is trying to change how clinical trials are set up so that way they're not destined to fail essentially
Yeah.
because they focus so heavily on the muscle. We'd like to have a skin aspect. Can you talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit?
So, yes, that is true. In most clinical trials, you require muscle weakness. You could have skin rash, and in most cases, you do have skin rash. If you see in Octagam study, in the ProDerm study, we have most patients with significant skin rash. In fact, most patients had moderate to severe skin rash, even though the study required to have muscle weakness. But I agree with you that the patients who have significant skin rash and do not have muscle weakness, and there are many patients like that, these skin rash causes worsening quality of life, causes severe itching, sometimes it causes pain. So they're very symptomatic for our patients. It'll be technically wrong to exclude those patients from the gambit of dermatomyositis, because if you require muscle weakness as an entry criteria, then some of those patients would be excluded. Now, having said that, it's changing. We are seeing some trends where there are trials are coming along where they're including 10% or 20% of those patients who only have skin and not so much muscle. But also, parts of it is we have to talk to FDA, because if the FDA says that you have to have muscle weakness, so the trial will be geared towards having muscle weakness. So part of it is convincing the FDA that look, skin is equally important, if not more, and we got to study some patients with only skin disease as well, even if they don't have muscle weakness at that point.
All right, and then another question, like we just heard, so depending on what physician you might be seeing, uh, you might have a gambit of therapies that are prescribed to certain patients. How can we better inform physicians of, say, like IVIG and the importance of it? Because I know that there's a lot of patients that still are having a hard time getting their
Absolutely.
physician prescribe IVIG.
Yeah, so I think the first of all, it has to start with diagnosis. So there is a significant problem in diagnosis. There's significant diagnostic delay. Sometimes these rashes are called as sunburn or atopic dermatitis or eczema and stuff like that. And that leads to significant delay in our patient, which these patients continue to suffer, sometimes months and sometimes years before they actually get right diagnosis. Sometimes they get diagnosed as lupus. If you get diagnosed with lupus, you're not going to get IVIG. So I think first part is correct diagnosis. Once you have a correct diagnosis, I think a lot of more and more physicians need to be informed about this clinical trial, ProDerm clinical trial, so that they can actually see themselves in some very scientific way in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial that how good IVIG works in our patient. Not only it works in our patient, it actually continues to improve our patient's life up until 24, 28 weeks. You continue to see improvement. But for patients, I think important is quality of life. So if you look at the quality of life parameter, SF36, we measure quality of life, and almost all aspect of quality of life, including emotional and various other aspects, but physical health, emotional health, various aspects improved in patients' own terms. And that's, I think, very important message to the patients and the providers, that their quality of life will be much better if they're on IVIG. And perhaps the resistance of using IVIG earlier should go away, given the excellent safety and tolerability data now.
Absolutely. One other question. I've been hearing some physicians, they say that they're telling their patients that there's like a plateau with IVIG after a certain amount of time, and that they should no longer receive that. Is there any
So,
kind
so
of...
I think there is a plateau of the maximum effect. If you look at the clinical trial, on an average, about 24 to 32 weeks is where we are seeing the max mean response. So remember, this is the max mean response. That means some were less, some were even more. So there are patients who may continue to have max response even after that. But even when you have the max response, if you see, even after that, there is a slow upward trend that these patients continue to improve almost up to a year sometimes. But the other problem is, once you have improved, would taking away IVIG would make a flare or not? That part of research we have to do to understand, we got the patient better by giving IVIG. How long should I give it? 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, continue throughout? And we have certainly have patients where when we cut down IVIG, they do fine. They got disease in remission, you slowly taper off IVIG, and they do great post that. But there are patients who actually worsens when we cut down IVIG. How do you differentiate who will worsen, who will not worsen? Perhaps those who worsen should require more long-term IVIG. Those who do not worsen perhaps should be tapered early on. And that part of research, I think we are lacking right now.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I haven't thought of that. Last little part. I thought it was very interesting that a lot of physicians aren't very confident in myositis specific antibodies. How can we better enhance that? What kind of labs need to enhance their laboratory techniques so we get accurate results? Because I think that's, to me at least, very much so in the direction of how myositis is going, and it shows the progression and different subtypes of diseases.
So everybody believes that myositis-specific antibodies are really important. Part of the problem is the accuracy is lacking, standardization is lacking. There is no one FDA-approved drug. There's actually not a single myositis-specific antibody that is approved by FDA. So that's where the problem is. Unless we get a higher accuracy, higher sensitivity and specificity of these myositis-specific antibody and get it FDA approved, it'll be continuing problem. They are important, but if they're true. They're not important if they're false. So that falseness has to go away for people to get confidence on our antibodies. Actually, I'm seeing a lot of damages from those who believe in antibody and those who don't believe in antibody, because those who believe in antibody may follow it blindly. We have patients who had positive antibody, no clinical feature, but now they're being treated with immune suppressive drug because their antibody was positive. Perhaps their antibody was false positive. And the same way, sometimes the patient has clinical feature, but the antibody is negative, perhaps false negative, and the doctors are hesitant to treat that patient because, look, antibody is negative. So I think this problem of antibody is a significant problem. We're actually doing some work in special interest group in myositis and autoantibody. How do we bring these different companies, different methods together to make a standardization that everybody does in this method, and it's the best method for a particular antibody? And it could be different methods for different antibody. For example, for Jo1, it could be ELISA. For some other antibody, it could be another ABC method. But we need to come as a group and collectively to decide this is how we're going to test this, because this is the best performance characteristic, and not base it on the insurance. Honestly, right now, the way we get antibody is based on what lab the patient insurance will pay for, which is not the perfect situation.
Well, I think you've answered many questions. And
is there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah.
No, I think one thing I will say that this is a very hopeful time for dermatomyositis and overall myositis patients. There are many clinical trials going, excellent drugs being tested. I would encourage patients who are listening to participate in these clinical trials, because it's sometimes not only about whether you will get better or not, what output you will get, but think about the greater good that's going to come to the community and the world because of your participation in clinical trial. I can tell you from my patient experience, those who have participated in clinical trial feel valued throughout their life, that they actually contributed in the FDA approval of IVIG drug. That's huge for them. I had 3 patients in the trial. Every time I meet them, they say, "Doc, thank you very much for telling me to get in the trial, because I feel I contributed. I read about it and I feel this is helping other patients. So I feel proud that I was part of this journey."
And how can patients get involved in clinical trials?
It's actually there through many organizations. The Myositis Association typically lists all the clinical trials that are active. Their Myositis Support and Understanding, but also many thought leaders. If you communicate with them, they will tell you which trial would be good for them or not. Actually, starting with your myositis doctor. Most myositis doctors have access to this information through clinicaltrial.gov. It's about talking to your doctor about clinical trials. One of the problem I feel is the physicians are hesitant to bring up clinical trial to the patient unless they've tried everything else. That's not the right situation. You should bring clinical trial as an option on the table very early on. And if you look at the patient survey, they say, tell us about the clinical trial as an option. So I can get option 1, it's risk and benefit. Option 2, there are certain risk and benefit. Option 3 is a clinical trial, it has certain risk and benefit. And let the patient decide which option you should pick. Sometimes physicians feel that they should be making the decision on patient behalf, which could be a problem, where some patient might be really willing to go clinical trial because they feel valued in contributing, would not get even an option by the doctor, which is not the right situation.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
Sure,
much.
thank you.
Dr. Aggarwal.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.